Relations and Communications for the Free Market Foundation, and we're all delighted to see such a wonderful turnout tonight. Dawie is such a crowd puller. It's always a great honor and pleasure to have Dawie Roodt with us. He's a long-standing friend and supporter of the Free Market Foundation, and he always gives not only great insights to our economy, but is an entertaining and highly controversial speaker. So expect a few interesting things tonight. He's a renowned national economist and currently undertaking extensive research into cryptocurrencies, but his day job, he's founder, director, and chief economist of the Efficient Group, a financial services company. He's chairman of Efficient Private Clients and closely involved in managing the wealth of those clients. He told me earlier that he takes rich people's money and he makes more of it. So if you've got a few millions, see him afterwards. I know it's always better to have a short introduction, but Dawie has got such a varied and interesting life and work CV that I really wanted to share some of it with you. So please bear with me. Sorry, Dawie. His career includes, he has a master's degree in economics. He was an economist at the Reserve Bank. He's presented more than 800 television and 1,500 radio programs. He was economics editor at a leading financial magazine, columnist for several publications. He's a member of BUSA and as well as NEDLAC. He's a member of the Institute of Directors and a council member of the Institute of Race Relations. Where he finds time to do his day job, I really don't know. He's also a frequent guest lecturer internationally and locally. He's the author of a book, Tax, Lies and Red Tape, from 2013. He has national colours for powered paragliding. He's an honorary member of the Golden Key International Honor Society. He's an ambassador of the Child Welfare Bloemfontein and Childline Free State. He's a lifetime honorary member of the Zoological Society of South Africa, and he's winner of the 2015 Pioneer Rally Assisted by Blind Navigator Award. They came second during the 2016 Pioneer Rally. Other interests and sport. He's an amateur ichthyologist. Now, there's a prize afterwards, one, that you can pronounce it, and two, that you know what it is. And it's not to do with insects. He takes active part in a variety of sport. He completed his first Comrades Marathon in 2015 and his second in 2016. He finished the 2017 Baikal Lake Ice Marathon and the 2018 Berlin Marathon. He completed his first Ironman, and for those of you who know what it is, you know the Ironman program, during 2018. He has a special interest and studies in communism, and he's married to a Russian wife. And this is new to me, I didn't know this one. He had a movie debut in Babylus. Now, I don't know if you were the Babylus or whether it was, we'll find out more about that. He's married to Marina, who is a vet. And his oldest daughter has a PhD in genetics, and his son, Christoph, is a lawyer, and he has twin daughters who are 6 years old. So, as you see, he's a very interesting person, as well as a leading South African economist. He's the most referenced economist in South Africa, and he received the prestigious Economist of the Year award from News 24. He's had his own TV program for over 13 years and is always in huge demand for media interviews and for speaking at events like this. So we are very honored and to have him. He's a very long-standing friend of ours. So, Dawie Roodt.
Thank you very much. You keep on inviting me back. I always think there must be a reason for that. I think somebody else was invited and he stood you up at the last moment. This is a live. I've got a camera in my office, and that's my fish tank. I've got a thing about lakes, and that fish tank is 2 meters deep. That's 2 meters, and it's 3 meters long, and it's 1 meter wide. And if you do a quick calculation, you'll see it's 6,000 liters. It's the size of a small swimming pool, and that is 6 tons. And the fish tank, empty fish tank, is a ton. Now, the reason why I show you this is because that's the closest you can get to a balanced ecosystem if you do it right. And that is what an economy is. An economy is a system that's in balance. And the moment when I start playing God and I start feeding my fish too much, I will overload the filter. All sort of bad things will start happening. Like, for example, they will start dying from all sort of poisons, nitrates and nitrates. If you have a bloom of algae, and your fish will die. So do as little as possible and the whole thing will stay quite nicely in balance. So I just wanted to mention that, and that's part of the reason why I've got an interest in fish. Before I get to my presentation, I would like to just say one or two things about this place that we call South Africa. We have a country called South Africa. We call it South Africa and we call it a country, but it doesn't really exist. And no country really exists. A country is merely an agreement between individuals. We in South Africa, we have decided that we're going to call this place, from Cape Town to the Limpopo, we are going to call this geographic area South Africa, and that is an agreement between people. And it changes all the time. The South Africa, what we know today, the country South Africa actually came into being in 1910 when 4 different countries were put together, and the next day we had a place called South Africa. 2 years ago, we had a country called Sudan, and the next day, we've got 2 countries called Sudan and South Sudan. So it changes all the time. Countries do not exist. Countries are simply agreements between individuals. Now, how do you get a country to operate, to become a real country? Well, you do that by appointing a bunch of people to establish something that we call a state, and then they run this geographic area that we call a country on our behalf. We call it democracy in the case of many countries, like, for example, South Africa. Now, what is that characteristic of the thing that we call the state? Well, first of all, the most important characteristic of a state is that the state monopolizes violence or power, because the state takes all the power, and essentially what happens is our rights, my right to take the law in my own hands, I am prepared to cede that to the state, provided that the state provides certain services to me. And those services are to protect me and to protect my stuff, to look after my things. And I am prepared to fund the state with my taxes for the state to do these sort of functions to protect me and to look after my stuff. The moment as the state starts stealing my stuff, start taking my stuff away, then the state loses its legitimacy, and we can talk and we can ask the question whether then we have the right to withhold our taxes to keep on funding the state. Now, I know Helen Zille recently suggested that we should think about the possible tax revolt, but if we do start with the tax revolt and we are successful at that, and it's going to be extremely difficult, and I'm going to show you now why, because the bulk of taxes that are collected are not paid over to the state by you and I. It's actually paid over to the state by the agents of the state, primarily big companies in South Africa. So if you really want to get a real tax revolt going, then what you need to do is to convince the big financial directors of the big companies in South Africa to participate in this tax revolt, which they are unlikely to do, because the next day the first guy that's going to start and support you, he will find himself in jail. But if we are successful in this, to start a tax revolt, then I am afraid you will really get to the heart of what a democracy is, and to the heart of what a country is, and that is to the budget. And the moment that you undermine the budget, and the moment the budget does not exist, especially the redistributional function of the budget, taking from the haves and give to the have-nots, then you do not have the reason to have a country anymore. So if we are successful in a tax revolt, I am afraid there's a very good possibility that it may be the end of South Africa politically as we know it. So I just wanted to mention that as a sort of an intro. Okay, let me get going on what has been in the budget, the heart of a democracy, and what's been going on in the budget, and a couple of comments about the budget. This is just a budget in a nutshell, and a few things that I think are important in the budget. Generally speaking, this is, and I've been analyzing the fiscal budget for many, many years. This is probably the shortest budget speech by any Minister of Finance ever, and there was just about nothing in the budget. there was really just about nothing in the budget. And I think more important is what hasn't been said and what actually has been said in this budget by the Minister of Finance. There are two obvious tones in the budget: the actual budget document, if you read through the document itself, and listening to the Minister of Finance. Listening to the Minister of Finance, making comments about the state-owned enterprises, whether we need them or not, making comments about the civil servants as an example. Are we overpaying them or not? Do we need that many? That sounds very new liberalist in my view. But reading through the actual document and looking through the statistics the last couple of years, that is certainly not the tone of the budget itself, the document itself. So that means, as far as I'm concerned, there is certain conflicts that is within the ANC and within the alliance that is likely to come to some sort of conclusion over the next short period of time, probably months. The first one is within the ANC, and that's an ideological conflict. That's an ideological conflict between the Titos and the rest. And I'm afraid the rest are probably going to win this war. The second conflict is within the alliance, and that is something that's the tail that's been wagging the dog for a long time, and that is the conflict between organized labor and especially the ANC or government. That is a conflict that must happen. I don't think Tito can last. I think this is probably the last budget of the Minister of Finance. On taxes, nothing really happened except for personal income taxes, the adjustment or lack thereof on personal income taxes. I'll touch on that a little bit. Eskom, on the expenditure side, also nothing except for Eskom. That's the only thing really that's of importance. And I think generally speaking, the estimates of the Minister of Finance in the budget are far too optimistic. And I think we are over the so-called fiscal cliff already. I can't see how we're going to turn this ship around. If I remember correctly, that's more or less what I've said 6 months ago in the medium-term budget and a year ago in the budget of the previous Minister of Finance, the smiling suit. Yeah, difficult to keep track with all our Ministers of Finance. Maybe just a comment about what's going on internationally. Politically, what is happening is that we see a move to more nationalism, a move to the right, if you like. There are many examples of that. Brexit is one of those examples. What's happening in Italy at the moment, that is another example. What happened in Catalonia last year and in Spain, that's another example. What is happening in America is another. Brazil is an excellent example of nationalism or a move to the right. That, of course, leads to things like, for example, trade wars, and that is a potential threat to the world economy and the world financial markets. I'm not too concerned about that, and the simple reason is because America is basically driving this trade war, Donald Trump versus the rest. America is a big, relatively closed economy, and they will not be affected that much by a trade war, and in fact is making quite a lot of progress sometimes and forcing the Chinese, as an example, into certain concessions. I don't think the trade war will damage the world economy that much. More potentially damaging or a bigger threat to the world financial markets is certainly monetary policy. And the reason why is because central banks, despite what they are telling us, central bank and central bankers also cannot look into the future. And the past 10 years, central bankers have been following an exceptionally loose monetary policy. What it means is that interest rates have been exceptionally low, and we've also seen this massive increase of liquidity created by central banks, and they've decided recently to reverse that, especially the Federal Reserve in the US, and gradually they've been withdrawing some of this liquidity, the opposite of quantitative easing called quantitative tightening. So we've been seeing some quantitative tightening, and we've also seen, especially coming from the US, a gradual increase in interest rates. So monetary policy internationally are getting slightly tighter, and under these sort of circumstances, there's always the possibility, and there are many examples in history where central banks overdo things, they tighten monetary policy too quickly, and forcing the economies into recession. That will have all sort of bad impacts on the rest of the world. Fortunately for us, the Fed recently decided to sit on their hands for a little while and not to increase interest rates any further, or at least not in the time being. And that, of course, had a positive impact on the world financial market. So last year, we said the rand, remember, when you increase interest rates in the US, that supports the US dollar. As the dollar goes up, other things goes down, like, for example, the rand. They've recently stopped or indicated that they're going to pause a little bit on monetary policy tightening, and the immediate result of that was that equity markets went up, the rand appreciated, and all the like. So, but that is, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest potential threat to the world economy, and especially the Federal Reserve in the United States tightening monetary policy too quickly. I am very much in favor of high interest rates. It's not the level of interest rates that are important, it's the change and the level of interest rates that is important. And if they change that too quickly, it can just have a negative impact on the US economy and the rest of the world. Maybe just a comment about the American economy. I think we are misunderstanding the American economy, economists. I think the US economy is perhaps much bigger than what we thought up to now, because we do not capture, by using the conventional measures of measuring the size of the US economy, we do not capture all the economic activities in the US economy, and therefore I think that the US economy is much bigger, and the rate of growth is much stronger in the US than what we thought up to now. The reason why I say so is because unemployment in the US is at the lowest it's been since the 1960s, while inflation is also very low. Now, theoretically, that's supposed to be the other way around. The one is low and the other one high. That's what it's supposed to be, according to what my professors taught me at university. That is not the case in the US. Both these measures are very low. Low levels of unemployment and low levels of inflation. That means probably, and it's probably got to do with the so-called gig economy and the fourth industrial revolution, is that production stays ahead of consumption in the economy. The moment consumption overtakes production in the economy, you get inflation. But because of the technological advances, production stays ahead of consumption all the time, and that's the reason why they don't have inflation, which simply means that the economy in the US economy is probably bigger than we think up to now. I think economists over the next couple of years will probably learn a lot more about this new technological developments that's happening, the so-called gig economy and all that goes with that, and we're probably going to change the definitions of what we call the economy. But for now, the US economy is growing at quite a nice and steady rate, but it's probably growing much faster than what we think up to now. Pretty much the same goes to the Japanese economy. The Chinese economy is slowing down, but will keep on growing. I don't want to talk too much about the other economies. I want to get to the budget and some other things in South Africa, but maybe also just one or two comments about one or two other countries there. I believe the Indian economy is the economy that's going to be the growth of global economic growth over the next decades perhaps, and an economy that I would like to keep an eye on, that I believe has got some serious potential if he can sort it out, and that's Jair Bolsonaro. I hope I pronounced that correctly, of Brazil. He got rid of Lula, and I hope he got rid of the Lula moment as well. Okay. And Lula's in war, in jail, by the way, and we need a couple of people in jail as well. Okay, let me start off by talking a little bit about politics in South Africa. And I've just read an article in the Business Day today, written by van Onselen. I think he's a brilliant, Gareth van Onselen. I think he's an absolute brilliant author. I think he writes brilliantly. Two things I would like to do. I would like to write brilliantly and sing beautifully. I can't do neither of those two things. And he's just an amazing writer. But he said the following, and he said it in a much better, in a much more elegant way that I could say that. And that is that I believe the ANC and the ANC coalition is the most destructive force this country has ever seen. They are incapable of the emotion called feeling ashamed of what they've done to this South African economy. They've destroyed this economy in all sort of manners. The state-owned enterprises, and I'm going to talk about Eskom a little bit later, is but a shadow of its former self. They've destroyed financially the state-owned enterprises and more. The education in South Africa is absolutely horrible. Health services is of the worst in the world. Infrastructure is collapsing and crumbling everywhere. Where they are trying to invest in infrastructure, the prices is multiples of the original budgeted estimates, and it takes multiples of years more than the original estimates. Madupi and Kusile are good examples. The whole thing is a corrupt organization. because of cadre deployment. The state's finances are totally unsustainable. I'm going to show that to you. And that is the reason why we have what we call today state capture. The ANC coalition has been bad for us. And I'll go back and I'll just analyze some numbers a little bit later. Here are some numbers. South Africa is the green line. This is South Africa's economic growth compared to other countries in the world. No, I don't need to say much more. This is South Africa's per capita GDP compared to other countries in the world. The really bad part, if you zoom into this number here, this is the emerging economies, the red one, and the green one is South Africa. And if you zoom into it, and I've compared South Africa to many other countries in the world, not only are we growing very slowly, but the really poor parts in the world is catching up with us, Sub-Saharan Africa. They are miles behind us still, but they're catching up very quickly. So on a per capita basis, we're doing absolutely horrible. This is fixed investment in South Africa. The green, over this one over here, that was the investment from the state-owned enterprises, especially Eskom. Subsequently, investments have been coming down. Now, you cannot grow an economy if you don't save and you don't use the saving to invest. Now, we are not investing in South Africa. I get the opportunity. There are two investors, the state and the private sector. Now, the state is investing less and less because they use their money to spend on other things, to buy votes, because that's what they are doing. And I've spoken to the private sector, and the private sector told me that they're not going to invest in one more brick in South Africa. Many countries, many companies. Of course, they don't say that in public. In public, they say, Ramaphosa is the best in sliced bread. But in reality is that in closed doors, in board meetings, they do not want to invest in South Africa. You do not invest in a country where the state is threatening to steal your property, as an example. You do not invest in a country where you do not have electricity, as an example, and many other things. This is life expectancy. This was the madness of Mbeki. Life expectancy, that's AIDS, of course. And the one good thing that Zuma did is that he reversed that. And life expectancy increased in South Africa in the recent years. That, as far as I'm concerned, that is the single most important indicator on whether you're good with whatever you do in your country. That's the indicator of success in any economy, life expectancy. Rich people, successful people are rich people. Successful people live for a long time. Successful and wealthy countries are countries with high levels of good qualification and safety and stuff like that. Life expectancy is the best measurement of that. Unemployment in South Africa, 28%. That's a narrow definition. The broader definition is much higher, as you know. It's about 40%, and we're talking about 10 million people without jobs. 10 million people. Oh, I'm supposed to go on. Okay. All right. Before you get too depressed, let me just touch on something that's working quite well. And that's the South African Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank is under good management. Remember, the Reserve Bank is a very attractive target for politicians for a number of reasons. One reason is that they hold our physical gold reserves. It's not that much, it's this much. I've seen it. Little heap of gold like this. It's not a big storeroom full of gold bars. That's not the case. It's a few bars like this. So that's one reason. The other reason, of course, is that the South African Reserve Bank is the official custodian of South Africa's reserves in excess of $50 billion. But more importantly, if you value the South African reserves, which are held in, most of that is held in treasury bills in the United States. So what happens, the platinum mine, for example, will export gold, will export platinum, and that platinum mine will be paid in dollars, and the dollars will end up at the South African Reserve Bank, and they will print rands and give it to the platinum mine essentially. So the dollars then at the South African Reserve Bank will be used to invest in interest-bearing instruments, typically treasury bills in the United States. So the money flows back into the US. And that, by the way, is part of the reason why the US dollar will remain a dominant currency for a very long time, because their capital market is the deepest and the most liquid of all markets in the world. That's a very interesting topic. People saying we're going to get rid of the dollar. It's not going to happen. The point I'm trying to make, so in the meantime, the rand depreciated or fell in value. So in rand terms, the dollar value went up. So there's a paper profit that the South African Reserve Bank made. And a paper profit at the moment is probably in the region of about $400 to $500 billion, a lot of money. If you can somehow get control of the South African Reserve Bank and change the agreements between the South African Reserve Bank and Treasury, you can theoretically get the Reserve Bank to pay out these profits, these paper profits. So that's part of the reason why I want to take over the control of the South African Reserve Bank, which fortunately Lesetja Kganyago succeeded in fighting off for some time. This is, by the way, part of the manifesto of the ANC, and that is that they want to nationalize the Reserve Bank, which in itself is not necessarily a problem, but the moment that you get closer to the Reserve, when any politician gets closer to the South African Reserve Bank, I get uncomfortable. Talking about the Reserve Bank, you also talk about currency. This is the South African Rand. The Rand is, on average, over time, approximately 50% undervalued. That's a red line. Currently, it's a little bit undervalued around here. So not very far off from its historic undervaluation levels. And this is part of the reason why I advise my clients to invest a substantial portion of their portfolio abroad. It's possible for the Rand to come back a little bit, but I guess over the medium longer term, the best guess for the currency is for a depreciation on average, say 5% or so annually. But still, the South African Reserve Bank not doing too bad a job. I do know, let me just go back to this graph, I do know a number of economists are actually criticizing the South African Reserve Bank for having increased interest rates recently. I am not that critical in the Reserve Bank, and the reason for that is simply because high interest rates simply means that you have space to move. You have dry ammunition. You can cut rates if something goes wrong. If your economy needs lower rates, you can cut it, assuming you believe that the Reserve Bank should be involved in your economy. But once you have very low interest rates, it's much more difficult to cut interest rates. So that is the important reason why I'm very much in favor of the Reserve Bank with relatively high interest rates, because it allows them moving space if necessary. So we have that now. Okay, that's just on the South African Reserve Bank. Unemployment, the important point I want to make with unemployment, we've seen this band of unemployment in South Africa in recent years, and clearly what has happened, especially recently, the unemployment levels broke out of that specific band. I'm not a technical analyst, I don't believe in technical analysis, but it was quite interesting to see that all of a sudden we're in a different world. And remember, when unemployment goes up to above a certain level, that leads to social tension, that leads to an environment where people mistrust each other, and that creates a wonderful opportunity for populist politicians with all sort of funny ideologies and ideas to find some support. And that's unfortunately where we find ourselves at the moment. South Africa's economic growth, you can quite clearly see where the zoom up period started. Since then, economic growth has been slowing down. My estimates on economic growth is that we're stuck in a trajectory of about 1%. In a good year, we can get 1.5% growth. In a bad year, 0.5% growth. That's more or less the growth trajectory of the South African economy. If the Minister of Finance tells us we're going to grow 2% in 2 years' time, that is probably not going to happen. This is our current account deficit. Suffice to say, there's a theory doing the rounds, especially coming from people that do not understand economics, like Usatu and the rest, is they suggest that we have to boost demand in the economy. If you boost demand in the economy but pay civil servants more, as an example, they're going to buy more Kentucky and more flat-screen TVs. That will lead to more demand in the economy, and that will lead to stronger growth and more production in the economy. That is untrue, because we're running a huge current account deficit. It's been a little bit lower, smaller in recent years, but if we boost local demand in the economy, we simply boost the Chinese economy. Okay, so that's not really going to help that much. Just a few comparisons between the Minister of Finance and my own estimates on some numbers in the fiscal accounts. Interesting to see, until about 5 years ago, the Minister of Finance's revenue estimates were always on the conservative side. Well, in fact, most of his numbers were on the conservative side. But about 4 or 5 years ago, in most instances, just about all instances, the Minister of Finance were far too optimistic on his estimates in terms of revenue, economic growth, and the like. And I think this year is going to be another example of the Minister of Finance being far too optimistic. So let's just have a look at, for example, economic growth. My expectations for economic growth is about 1% for this year. Like I've said, we're stuck in this trajectory of about 1%, while the Minister of Finance is expecting 1.5% or so. The fiscal deficit, and let me give you a simple tool to analyze the fiscal deficit and why that is important. Remember, economists quite often express certain numbers as a percentage of the economy. It's handy to do that because you can compare certain things over time, and you can compare certain countries with one another. The problem with whatever number you're looking at relative to GDP is that we're not really sure what should be in GDP. And economists argue about this all the time. But let's assume we all sort of look at the economy more or less the same, and let's assume that we all accept that we make mistakes, but at least the mistakes are consistent over time. Then we have a kind of a number that we can work with. All right, the GDP, or fiscal deficit relative to GDP, that 4.6% and the 4.5% of the Minister of Finance is one of those numbers. So we have, roughly speaking, a fiscal deficit in South Africa that is currently running at approximately 4% of GDP. The fiscal deficit is how much the politicians spend, what they get in by way of various taxes, and the difference between these two, and that's how much they need to borrow every year, and we express that number, the borrowing, as a percentage of the economy. Okay, so the fiscal deficit is running at 4%, actually more than 4% of GDP. That's the fiscal deficit. In the meantime, the economy is growing at a rate of, let's call it 1%. That means, relative to GDP, the state debt to GDP will go up by the remaining 3%. A little bit more, in fact, because you have to pay interest in that as well. So this is a nice and easy tool to understand the fiscal deficit. If the fiscal deficit is 4% to GDP and the economy is growing to 4%, your debt to GDP ratio remains unchanged. If your fiscal deficit is 4% to GDP and the economy is growing at 1% to GDP, your debt to GDP goes up by 3%. So that's why it's important to do one or two things. If you have a debt problem, you either have to cut back on your fiscal deficit, which means you probably have to spend less, or you need the economy to grow much faster. The fiscal deficit in itself doesn't mean anything. There are other things that are important as well, like, for example, economic growth as well. So there's a nice and easy tool to understand the fiscal deficit. For that reason, because I think the fiscal deficit is going to exceed the minister's estimates, I'll come back to that a little bit later, the debt to GDP ratio is likely to exceed the minister's own estimates as well, and I've got a number of about 57% fiscal debt to GDP ratio by the end of this year. I'm going to come back to that. Okay. So, what's this budget? This budget is pretty much the Minister of Finance is a waiting exercise. What's he waiting for? He's waiting for the elections, obviously, because the theory is, and I hear many economic or political analysts saying this, we're waiting for the elections because the good guys will expand or will consolidate their political base, and once they've done that, they will start doing good things. And that is not my theory. I don't think so, because the good guys, supposedly, were also the good guys that were mostly involved the past 10 years of plunder during the Zuma administration. Okay, let's have a look at the big picture. The big picture, there are two lines here. The red one, I show this every year, I just update it. The red line is state spending as a percentage of GDP. This is the so-called main budget, and the blue one is state revenue as a percentage of GDP. Now we can pick up also very interesting things in this number. By the way, you can clearly see where the Zuma years started. You can just see it. So we've seen a dramatic increase in state spending relative to GDP, and then it just kept on going up. If we look at the budget of the Minister of Finance, remember we have a rolling budget. His estimates for next year and the year thereafter is for even more state spending. So state spending will continue to go up. And the bulk of a lot of that spending goes to paying the salaries of the overpaid, bloated civil service anyway. So I'm going to get back to that a little bit. The bottom line is state revenue as a percentage of GDP. Now the reason why state revenue relative to GDP has been going up is primarily because we've seen an increase in the various tax rates. Not because the economy or tax buoyancy improved. It's simply because they increased the tax rates. That's why we've seen an increase in taxes, but we've probably reached the end of that. There's something called a Laffer curve, where you can keep on increasing taxes and you will collect more, and you increase taxes and you collect more, but at a certain point when you increase taxes past a certain point, you start collecting less. And that's probably where we are at the moment. The difference between the two then is the fiscal deficit that I've spoken about. So where do they get the money from? The bulk of the money, 39%, they get from personal income taxes, a direct tax. I'm going to analyze that. And the irony here is, well, let me get to that later. The second most important tax is a value-added tax, 26%. That is an indirect tax. So we've got an income tax, a direct tax, 39% of personal income taxes. An indirect tax called value-added taxes, 26% total contribution, and another direct tax called company taxes, the third most important tax by the Minister of Finance, 18%, and a couple of smaller taxes over there. So those are the three major taxes of the Minister of Finance. Now, I've analyzed, and this is quite a optimistic kind of calculation. I've mentioned that the last couple of years, the Minister of Finance has been overly optimistic in his estimates on revenue and economic growth and the like. In the current financial year, which will end the end of next month, remember the financial year of the Minister of Finance starts on a very appropriate date, the 1st of April. That's when it starts. So in the current financial year, the collection of taxes, according to the Minister of Finance, is probably going to be more than 40 billion rand less than the original budgeted estimates. My quite optimistic estimates is that the tax collections for the next financial year is going to be also below the estimates of the Minister of Finance, and I've got a number of only 16 billion rand. It's probably going to be more than that. So the Minister of Finance is probably too optimistic. There was what we need in South Africa, and I'll show you why just now. We need higher VAT rate. If you want to increase any taxes, you have to increase VAT. But the Minister of Finance cannot do that, because if you do that, Kusatu is going to burn the place down. And so what do? You look for an alternative indirect tax, and one of those alternative indirect taxes that you can increase, and people for some reason simply keep on accept that, and that is the petrol price, and we've seen an increase in the petrol price. If anything, I would actually get the Minister of Finance to increase the petrol price by even more and reduce some of the other taxes. So that is just the petrol price increase that we have seen. Now this is the interesting part. The irony in South Africa is that the ANC is dependent for the bulk of its revenue from people that do not support the ANC. And that's personal income tax payers. And we have seen that's a blue line. That is a contribution of personal income taxes to the total tax stake of the Minister of Finance, and that is currently running at about 40%. And it has been increasing quite a lot in recent years. And I'm going to give you a bit of a breakdown just now. So there was a huge increase in personal income taxes, and it's easy to increase personal income taxes. All you need to do is to do nothing. And that's what we saw in the current financial year. So the effect of bracket creep, the effect of inflation, push you into a high income tax bracket, and the result of that is high personal income taxes. The second most important tax, and that is value-added taxes that has remained relatively flat. In fact, in the last year, we saw a value-added tax, despite an increase of 1%, not really collecting much more. So value-added taxes has been pretty much a flat line in recent years. The one that really concerns me is the company tax, the bottom one. And company taxes keep on contributing less and less to the total tax stake. And company taxes is a much better indicator of underlying economic activities. In fact, I would like to get rid of company taxes. But if you want to measure the economic activity in your economy, company taxes and the collection thereof is usually a very good indicator of underlying growth in the economy. Let's compare some taxes. This is personal income taxes to the rest of the world. South Africa's personal income taxes are very, very high, the marginal rate, and it kicks in at a rate of at an income of only $100,000. And as you can see, it's only France, Austria, and Japan that are taxed higher than South Africa. Our personal income taxes are far too high. Personal income taxes, there are 121,000. That's not a typo. 121,000 individuals in South Africa that pay 29% of total personal income taxes. 15% of total personal income tax payers. That's not registered, but actual payers. There are 12 or 13 million registered payers, but only 6.5 million actual taxpayers on personal income taxes. But 15% of them, that's less than 2 million people in South Africa, personal income taxpayers, pay more than 80% of total personal income taxes in South Africa. They, and especially the 121,000, the really rich people, that are probably a couple of them in this room tonight, they are mostly not ANC supporters. That is the dilemma of the ANC. You are dependent on this small handful of individuals to fund all this corruption and incompetence. South Africa's corporate taxes, company taxes, more or less in line, or on average, compared to many other countries in the world. By the way, Donald Trump cut the company taxes from 35% down to 21% in one swoop. And that's part of another reason why the US economy is not doing too badly. But South Africa's corporate tax is sort of in the middle. And as an emerging economy, I would like to see South Africa's corporate taxes actually being lower. Companies don't pay taxes. Companies always shift their total tax burden down to individuals. In fact, there's very nice research. The higher your corporate taxes, the lower the salaries those corporates pay to their workers. So it's the workers paying the taxes, or the customers, or the shareholders, but it's never the company themselves. I would like to get rid of, talking about company taxes. Do you know that we have in South Africa just over 500,000 companies? Of that, just over 500,000, 530,000 companies in South Africa, 239, not 1,000, 239 companies pay 47% of total corporate income taxes. So keep on, saying all sort of nasty things about Johan Rupert and those guys. They pay those taxes. Okay.
It's easy. Tax revolt, only 239 companies.
You just need to get to 239 financial directors and off you go. Value-added taxes in South Africa, relatively low. India recently increased their value-added taxes. We need to there's no such thing as a good tax, but some taxes are more bad than others. VAT is one of those less bad taxes. And I would like to see an increase in VAT and lower personal income taxes or corporate taxes, for example. Where's the money going to? The bulk of your money goes to, where am I now? This is sorry, I've gone the wrong way. So, sorry, I think I'm pressing the wrong buttons all the time. Where's your money going to? I think I'm going to show you that now. Value-added taxes. Oh, some special announcements on taxes. As I've mentioned, there was an increase in personal income taxes. There was just about nothing in the budget about taxes. Personal income taxes were increased. The value-added tax, nothing. Corporate income tax, nothing. And nothing else really. Some adjustments on a few levies, some adjustments in the so-called sin taxes and so on. But the only major announcement on revenue was the significant 13 billion rand increase in personal income taxes. On the spending side, where's your money going to? And the bulk of your money is going to education. Nearly 400 billion rand goes to education, and a couple of other things, and I'll show you on a graph where the rest of the money is going to, which is quite interesting. So let's have a look on state spending in the last couple of years, and let's see if we can find who the culprits are, who we can thank for what's been going on in the state finances at the moment. And this is state spending as a percentage of GDP, and state spending start accelerating and increasing during the second half of the Mbeki era, and that was also when Trevor Manuel was the Minister of Finance. But the interesting thing is Trevor Manuel was the guy that reduced state spending quite significantly. And the reason why he started increasing state spending during this period was because state debt levels by then was reduced quite dramatically. There was space to increase state spending. But the part that I really want to point out is this one over here. And this is, I don't know if you recognize this guy, it's our good friend Zuma. And the guy, the Minister of Finance that was there mostly while Zuma was president, was Pravin Gordhan. Now, I don't think Pravin Gordhan is a bad guy. I think he's a nice guy. I think he's a clever guy. And I do not think he's corrupt. But things really started going horribly wrong when Pravin Gordhan was the Minister of Finance. That is the reality. There were some reasons. Zuma is the reason. The financial crisis is the reason. The tripartite, the alliance or all reasons, but it happened while he was the Minister of Finance. Of course, there were a couple of guys, the smiling suit, as I've mentioned, the weekend special and so on, but it was mostly when Pravin Gordhan was the Minister of Finance when things started going wrong. This is just a comparison of South Africa's education to the rest of the world. I will send this presentation. You can have a look. I'll put it on your website if I may, Leon, and then everybody can have a look. There are two studies, the Pearl study and the Tim study. Don't read that before you go to bed. The point, interest on state debt. Interest on state debt, that's the fastest growing big expense item by the Minister of Finance, and as debt level keeps on going up, we need to spend more on this, on interest on state debt as well. And this is something that we need to be, a number that we need to keep an eye on. There are currently, that's the red line, there are currently nearly 18 million people receiving grants in South Africa. That increased by 500,000, 500,000 the past year. There are currently 16.5 million people with jobs in South Africa, and that increased by 300,000 the past year. Now that's the trend, and clearly, as what we can see, is that the number of people receiving grants are increasing at a much stronger rate than the number of people with jobs in South Africa. By the way, I am pretty much in favor of these grants. I prefer a means-tested grant before. We can't just give grants to. Prefer to have the kids you have to prove that the kid has been inoculated, and like what they do in Brazil, that the kid is going to school and stuff like that. But this is something that we need to do. We cannot allow people to die of hunger. But this is unsustainable. If we can't get this economy to grow, we cannot afford to pay nearly 80 grants to 18 million people. We just do not have the money. Now, this is a bit of a complicated number. You are the first guys to see this. Now, we all know that the civil servants in South Africa is a bit of a problem, and I've made a bit of a comparison here. Now, the first line there is the total spending of the state. Now, what I'm doing here, I'm using IMF data, and I'm not 100% sure how that data is put together, because the definitions in some instances that they use is not exactly the same definition that the South African Reserve Bank uses. So I've decided to use IMF data because my thinking is that at least whatever they do it the same for all countries in the world. So I've got a comparison, I can compare to other countries in the world. That's what I want to achieve. So total spending, which is very much in line with our numbers, total spending of the developed world, state spending relative to GDP, is roughly about 40% or so, which is pretty much in line with South Africa's spending as well. This one here. So we spend as much on the state as other countries spend on the state. Nothing funny. We're not out of line there. If you look at the compensation part, and that is how much we pay our civil servants as a percentage of the economy, then things started to change quite a bit. In the developed world, they spend 9% of GDP on salaries of the civil servants. Developing economies, pretty much the same, 10%. In the case of South Africa, we spend 14% on salaries. So we pay our civil servants, from this set of number, what we've seen so far, quite handsomely. In fact, I've done some research, and this corresponds with some of the research that I have done. The average civil servant in South Africa is between 40 and as much as 80%, but the average is around about 40-50%, better remunerated than the private sector equivalent. So that's more or less in line with these numbers. The civil servants and total employed by the state, and again South Africa is pretty much in line with the rest. We employ about 14% of total people employed in your country is employed by the civil service. But then you get to the really scary part. Remember, you won't believe this, but at least based on the way that we analyze the economy and calculate the size of the economy, the state is also a contributor to economic activities. Now that's what we looked at. So for every contribution if you look at the size of the economy, how much do we pay our civil servants, and how much does that add to economic activity? So put differently, if you want your economy to grow, and this is in US dollar terms, PPP dollars by the way, to make sure it's comparable over many different countries. In the case of the developed world, If they spend 23 cents on their civil service, that will add 1 rand extra. Or let me put it differently. For every 1 rand that the economy grows in the developed world, they spend 23 cents of that on government expenditure. 26 cents in the case of developing economies, and in the case of South Africa, 36 cents. So there's something very weird going on. We spend a lot more on the civil servants' salaries in South Africa, but what we get out is significantly less than other countries in the world. Why is that? And the only answer to that is that the productivity of our civil servants are much worse than any one of those other countries in the world. And that's the crucial issue here. We don't necessarily have too many civil servants. Though we don't necessarily overpay the civil servants, but the civil servants do very little. That's the point. They're not productive enough. So in order to get that ratio right, we'll either have to get rid of a lot, we have to pay them less, or they must become more productive. That's what we need to do. Okay, that's some interesting stuff. I plan to write a nice article about this. This is some new stuff that we've done. On the spending side, the only real surprise on the spending side is that the Minister of Finance decided to give Eskom another 23 billion rand for the next 3 years. Now that doesn't make sense to me. I had a look at the financial statements of Eskom. It's impossible for Eskom to survive from this. So I don't know what the story is here. I just don't know what the story is here. I'll just touch on that just now. I don't know what's going on there. There's something going on there, and I don't know what it is. Okay, just a couple of numbers on... this is just debt. I think this is important maybe to touch on. Well, I think I've mentioned that. That's a fiscal deficit. I showed you those numbers again. This is the state debt to GDP ratio. And again, you can quite clearly see what's been happening on state debt. Trevor Manuel was the guy that reduced state debt quite dramatically. He halved state debt relative to the size of the GDP, and today's state debt is simply exploding, and state debt today is the highest it has ever been, and that's the reason why I say we're probably over the so-called fiscal cliff already. You need to cut back, like that measure that I've given you. You have to cut back on state spending, and you cannot spend that at additional 3% relative to GDP. 3% of GDP is equal to 10% of state spending. Let me repeat that. If we want to maintain state debt relative to GDP at one level, we have to cut back on state spending. How much do you have to cut back on state spending? And the answer is in nominal terms, you have to cut state spending by 10%, which is politically impossible to do. It's impossible to do politically. You need a dictator to do that. All right, so what now? The state-owned enterprises will be broken down in threes. South African Airways will be broken up in threes. That is what the CEO, that's what he says. You still got that bet with him, Leon. So it's going to be broken up in three. And then the spokesman, Charlie, what's his name? He said, no, that's not the case. They're not going to break it up in three. So I don't know if they're going to break it up in three or not. It makes sense to me, if you want to break it up, and break it into smaller pieces. I disagree with many other people. In the case of, for example, Eskom, they want to break it up into three: generation part, the transmission part, and the distribution part. And I pretty much agree with that. It's a good idea to do that. But that's only the first step. It doesn't make sense to do this if this is where you're going to end. You must take the next step. And the next step must be to either close down or to sell or to privatize or whatever the case might be. So it doesn't make sense to break it into three pieces and then you're not going to do anything. In the case of Eskom, they probably have about, more than 20,000 too many people working for Eskom. You have to get rid of them. There are too many people. And that is the elephant in the room. And something that I'm very concerned about Cyril Ramaphosa and also Pravin Gordhan. One of the first thing that he did was to get rid of the boards at Eskom and many other state-owned enterprises. And one of the first things that Pravin Gordhan did was to overrule those boards when they did the right thing. And that is told the employers or the workers, we cannot afford further wage increases. And Pravin Gordhan simply overruled them. So why do you have a board if you overrule them when you do the right thing? So that's the question. Will they get rid of people working at Eskom and other parasitals, and I'm not so sure about that. But getting to Eskom, the generation part, what can you do about the generation part? Can you privatize it? Can you close it down? The thing is, you can't really privatize the generation part because the old generation, the old power stations, they need so much money in maintenance that I won't buy one of those. I won't invest in that. In the case of the new ones like Medupi and Kusile, if they want to privatize that, you can only privatize that if you sell it at a huge discount, a massive discount of hundreds of billions of rands sometimes, in some instances. So again, I don't know how you can do that on the generation side. So I don't really see opportunity on the generation side. There are other things that you can do on the independent power producers, for example, liberalize that and allow them to sell their power to. But on the Eskom generation part, I don't know what they can do to fix that problem. The transmission part, that is fine. The transmission part is doing okay. That's the big pylons, these big cables. I think that is doing fine. That is what the economists call a natural monopoly. And the best that you can probably do is to sort of use some sort of concession that the private sector can run that. So I don't have much of an issue with the transmission part. The interesting part is the distribution side. If you want to make money, that is probably where you can make money and where the private sector can get involved in. Unfortunately, you've got somebody else involved in, and that is the local authorities. And that's where they make their money. And they're not going to let go there, despite the fact that they owe zillions of money to Eskom anyway. So the only opportunity where I can see that the private sector can potentially get involved in is on the distribution side, but then you have to do something about the local authorities. And they are a bunch of dats, mostly, as we know. I think that we're going to see a downgrade because of this. What I would have done, let me tell you what I would have done. In the case of the state-owned enterprises. I would have, in the case of Eskom, and in fact most of the state-owned enterprises, I would have taken all the guaranteed debt of the state-owned enterprises on the balance sheet of the state. That's what I would have done. Because in the case of Eskom, it is in excess of 400 billion rand. If you do that, you will get a downgrade, by the way. But that is what I would have done. And then I will handle each one of these state-owned enterprises depending on circumstances. Either close them down. In the case of South African Airways, you can't close them down. You have to pay in order to close them down. You can't give it away. Nobody wants it because you need about 20 billion rand to close it down. You can't get anything. So that's what you will do in the case of South African Airways. But take the debt on your balance sheet because they are going to demand you pay off that debt anyway over time. So that's what I would have done, and depending on circumstances, I would have either closed down or private sector, whatever the case may be. So that's what I would have done. And of course, the reason why they haven't done much on the state and enterprises is because of the election. I know many analysts are saying, but you can't expect them to do much because the election is around the corner. I'm afraid that's not a good enough reason for me. Because it's this election, in 2 years we've got another election. So when are we going to start doing what we need to do? Okay, I've got my own manifesto, and I'm going to have a look at the different political parties. Let me just see if I can zoom in on this. And I'm going to analyze the different political parties, and I would like to see what you think of my analysis. Okay, this is my election manifesto, and let's see if you're going to vote for me. I've started the political party. I'm going to call it the Libertarian Party. I will change the constitution, and I will strengthen property rights, private property rights. That is the single most important economic right in any economy if you want that economy to be successful. Strengthen private property rights. It's sacrosanct. You don't touch it. Never. And if you want to expropriate for a very good reason, then you don't pay market prices, you pay market prices plus something. Private property rights, you never ever touch private property rights. I would try to strengthen the independence of the Reserve Bank, and I will lower the inflation target to 2%. I don't like a band, I like a point target. And I don't like these high levels of inflation, I like inflation much lower, 2%. If you want to disagree with me, make a note, we can disagree afterwards. I will investigate and support the use of new technology. Blockchain is a good example. Abolish the minimum wage and the unemployment insurance fund. I will abolish all forms of BE and official race-based discrimination and replace it with a poverty development program. I will establish a qualifying means test for the child support grant. I've spoken about that. Increase the qualifying age of state pensions gradually to 70 years of age, and then thereafter to more. You're still 20 years away, Leon, don't worry. Allow state hospitals and clinics more autonomy and convert the Department of Health into a state-funded medical funds. Place Eskom and SAA and so on under business rescue, and I've mentioned that already. Develop a basic infrastructure for housing and transfer full ownership to the poor and use and sell the rest of state land to fund that. Abolish all taxes on capital. Reduce corporate income taxes, abolish taxes on dividends, abolish all small and irritating taxes like vehicle taxes and financial transaction taxes and silly things like that. Increase the tax on fuel. Reduce the number of personal income tax categories to 3 only, and we may have to increase the personal income tax rates. So I'm honest as a politician. I would like to establish a fiscal board, and I will use the value-added taxes as an instrument for the fiscal board. A fiscal board is that you have you get an independent body like a fiscal board. It's pretty much the same as the Reserve Bank, and you give them a target, and the target is to make sure that they maintain a balanced fiscal budget over the economic cycle. So if the fiscal budget opens up to the fiscal deficit opens up too wide, they will purely independently increase VAT, and if the fiscal deficit starts smalling, they will reduce VAT again, to make sure that the fiscal deficit over time is zero. They use that as an instrument, an independent instrument. Scrap VAT on all, on everything except on exports. On investments, abolish all exchange regulations. Completely abolish that. Allow trustees greater discretion on investments decisions with no prescribed assets whatsoever. Change the government's employment pension fund to a defined contribution fund and allow members to migrate to other funds if they want to. Abolish the PIC except for non-pension funds related functions. On education, declare a state of emergency in education. Increase the length of the school day. Consider schools on Saturday. Ban trade unions until we've got our education standards up to the average internationally. Not the best, just the average. Issue coupons and allow parents to just choose which schools they want to send their kids to. Provide students with the best students with loans and require them to repay their loans. Provide reinstate the education colleges and launch a project to make South Africa's primary education world class. Civil servants, reduce the number of civil servants, in inverted commas, pay the rest what they're worth, and many thousands will lose their jobs. Let's be clear about this. Reduce the cabinet to a maximum of 10 ministers, and I always ask this question, what is the job of the Minister of Sport? Imagine what is the job, the Deputy Minister of Sport, what is his job? I haven't got a clue. Fire all policemen and allow the communities to reappoint their own policemen and build police stations from glass. And I just came back from Georgia last week, and this is what they've done. It was the most hated and probably the most corrupt police force in the world. And they fired all policemen, all of them. And they allowed Georgia, and they allowed their local communities to appoint their own policemen. They've got something they called a public service hall. It's a big place. You go in there, and you go and sit at a cafeteria. This is not a joke. And you need an urgent passport. You order your cappuccino, and you order your passport while you sit there. And they bring it to you in less than 1 hour. You go, the average time that you stand in the queue is 7 minutes. If you walk in there and you register a company, you do that in less than 20 minutes. If you come pick up documents, you come pick up documents the same that you pick up a McDonald's burger. You've got a drive-through. And that is in a third world country, an ex-Soviet Union country called Georgia. Amazing. Who should you vote for? Who should you vote for? Now I've got can you see that? Let me just see if I can make it a little bit bigger. Over there, all right. Okay, I've had a look at the big political parties, and I simply couldn't get information on all of them. So I might change my view about some of them, maybe. But let me just tell you what I think of the different. I think there are 3 criteria that you can use before you vote for a political party. The first one is that you have to look at the policy of that political party. Read through the manifesto and then decide, do you think that's good or bad? Second one, look at the leadership. Do you like the leadership? Do you think you can trust them? Do you think they're good? And the third one, look at their track record. And of course, they don't all have track records, but look at their track records. So let's have a look at the biggest one, and that's the ANC. Their policy, give it a name, and I would call it a socialist policy. And it's becoming more so. If you look at their leadership, it is at least a compromised leadership. If you look at their track record, it is the most destructive force this country has ever seen. The DA, their policy, I would call it ANC light. The leadership is a weak political leadership. I think Musi can run a church. He's not good at running a political party. The track record is mostly good of the DA. The DFF, populist bunch in terms of policy. I don't know what the policy is. You can maybe call it populist, or you can call it, there are so many names. Call it Chavistas, Hugo Chavez. They're all over the place. The same with the leadership. You don't know what you have in the leadership. Sometimes they're really cute, and sometimes they really sound like a dangerous bunch of harlequins. The track record, they don't really have a track record. The IFP, mostly free. I like their policies. The leadership, let's call it conventional. And the track record, a bit of a questionable. The NFP, socialist. I can't say anything about leadership, and they don't have a track record. The EFF, their policies are very free. The leadership, let's call it conventional, and they don't have a track record. The UDM, left-leaning. I was actually surprised reading through their manifesto. I thought I would call the UDM more of sort of a centrist, a right-leaning political party. They're not. I think they're more left-leaning. Leadership, pretty much conventional and not a track record. ACDP, that's a nice choice. They're pretty much free, but I don't know much about their leadership and their track record. They do not have anything. AEIC, I haven't got a clue what they stand for. And COPE is one of those parties that I thought will be sort of right-leaning as well. And going through the manifesto, I think we can call them a left-leaning political party. Leadership pretty much conventional and not much of a track record there. I'm actually angry at COPE because I thought they're going to do something. Okay, so that's your responsibility. I think some people say that it's your responsibility to vote for the ANC and to make sure that the EFF doesn't get that many votes. Vote strategic, that is the word that is used. I disagree with that. I was scared of democracy in 1994. I'm not scared of democracy anymore. Vote for the political party that you believe will be the best for South Africa. Unfortunately, based on research from people that know much more than me about politics, they reckon that the ANC will still win a substantial majority. They may lose a majority in Gauteng. I really hope so. The party that of the bigger parties is probably going to gain most is probably the EFF, and I believe some of the smaller parties like COPE, for instance, is also going to gain quite nicely in the relative terms. Where are we in South Africa? We are in very deep trouble in South Africa. Things are likely to keep on deteriorating in terms of unemployment and poverty and so on in the country, and I'm very concerned about the political environment in which we find ourselves at the moment. The social tension in South Africa, you can cut it with a knife, and I'm very concerned about our political leaders or the quality of our political leaders. What I'm mostly really concerned about is that the government in South Africa is simply not taking any responsibility for the damage that they've done to this country. And it is really time for us, and I don't do this as an economist standing in front of people, but it's time for us to punish them. They've done immense damage to this economy, and it's time for us to remove them. The ANC is like apartheid. You cannot reform it. You have to replace it. And that's where we are. Thank you very much for listening to me. Can I take questions? Questions?
Dawie, that was amazing. I'm sure it's extremely comprehensive and thought-provoking, and I'm sure it's generated very many questions. If you would like to put your hands up and say who you are, and if you represent a private capacity or if you represent an organization, please say so. So, should we have Chris and another, Dave, and okay, we'll start with you, Chris Gilmore.
Dawie, thank you very much. That was wonderful insights. You say Tito is perhaps probably on his way out. Now, what I've been hearing is that maybe Maria Ramos is going to be the next Minister of Finance. Is that what you're hearing?
I've heard that as well.
Yeah.
Have you had a look at ABSA's share price?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Yeah. I'm afraid I can't comment, having worked there for a while.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. Yeah, I heard that's one possibility. There are one or two other rumors as well. I would like to see him stay. In fact, I would like to see Tito becoming president. He's a bit of a funny guy, bit of a lost copy sometimes, but and I know he's got some political aspirations. I know that, and I've had a privilege to talk to him a couple of times. I really do like him, and he likes the finer things in life, like Brandon.
Dave Nichols, private. I used to be an Eskom person until the end of last year. I was one of the 8 who got shoved out. Just a question on a commenter. I see the 23 billion rand to Eskom as a disastrous starting point because it's putting us in. Because essentially what's happened is that Eskom's tariff increase has never been where NERSA some say it should be. So Eskom's run into debt because it's just kept the lights on. And we've now a situation where the government is giving Eskom a cash bailout rather than making NERSA give the correct tariff. And we've then got energy subsidies, which is classically very difficult to remove from a society. Comment?
Yeah, I would like to, and I don't want to go into debate with you, but obviously you are better positioned to talk about Eskom than me. But I've got a problem with NERSA, and I think NERSA shouldn't exist. I would close NERSA down. Because I've been at their presentations and they tell me, based on A, B, and C, they give so much increase for this and that. And I've been in this forecasting business for a very long time. And I can tell you I can't do it. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So our NERSA, so you have Eskom demanding certain increases because they've got a bunch of economists and analysts and so on making predictions on the future price of electricity and demand and that sort of stuff. And you have the same people duplicating pretty much the same sort of calculations at NERSA, and then they come together and they make a call, all right, we're going to do this. They don't know. They don't know. They don't know what the electricity price should be. That's the point I'm trying to make. And the only way that you can know what the electricity price can be or should be is to allow the market to tell you what it should be.
Let me give you an example of a problem and why it doesn't work anywhere in the world. I was head of Eskom's nuclear before in December. And I often have thought, what would happen if somebody came to me and said, well, we're going to break Eskom up. You're chairman of Koeberg Nuclear Power Station. Go into the commercial market. My opening statement will be, fine. I want a 5-year PPA, absolutely guaranteed. And I want to guarantee that if you stop using my power early, you're going to pay my decommissioning costs. And I'll charge you £1.50. And they're going to say, excuse me, but we know your cost of generation is about 40 cents. So, my competitor is Uncolit gas turbine station around the corner. They're running diesel fuel and they're costing £3 a unit. Or the renewables that don't really work at night or where the wind's not blowing. So you're stuck. And so two choices, turn Cape Town's lights off or pay me the money. And by the way, I want a sovereign guarantee to back up my 5-year PPA because I've got no basis, you've got no balance sheet. So I think you're being wary that my comment, and this is why on Eskom and the power system is that nobody has ever made the free market in the power system actually work on a sustained period.
Not true.
Where?
Lots of countries.
To give me one.
Scandinavian countries.
Scandinavian countries have...
I'm off then.
That's
Okay, but I'll ask you otherwise.
Can we take this
Offside, I'll do it.
offline and we'll keep the questions directed and I'll ask you later. Thank you.
I would like to talk to you if I may.
Roger,
Yes.
and then Terry. Can we keep the
Hi.
questions short and succinct, please?
Rob Jeffrey. I think you really answered this question. Well, it's not a question. The only way this country can ever grow is to get foreign and domestic fixed investment in real projects going once more. I could find nothing in this budget or in the political system at the moment which fosters anything in that direction. But maybe you have a different take.
No, neither could I.
I don't believe it. We have two economists in the same room.
Agree.
Terry Martin.
Dawie, The bottom line is what you said. You said market forces. Unfortunately, market forces cannot exist because there is highly regulated electricity in this country. What you have to do before you do any privatization, and I'm very much in favor, is to deregulate. What does that mean? That if I want to put up a tiny generator and my neighbor wants to buy it from me, I can. If a farming community wants to get it, they can. That would kill Eskom very quickly. And then when you sell your generators at a power generators at a later stage, you sell them at a price where people know what the price is. And even if you've got an old power station, which maybe you'll only sell for 10 Rand, that's better than keeping it going at the moment because it's costing you money. And you sell everything. You sell Madupi for 10 billion Rand, even though it's cost you 200 billion Rand. You just sell, and including the transmission grid, you may even sell 50-50 so that the state can keep control of it. And you could probably wipe off most of Eskom's debt by selling everything. Every single thing, but not privatise only, you've got to deregulate.
Yeah. I must tell you, I'm not an expert in this, but as far as I know, as far as I know, it's not impossible to sell your electricity privately to somebody else. In fact, I'm kind of involved in a consortium where we can generate electricity by making use of all sort of things. The biggest problem, and we can use the transmission network of Eskom to transport our electricity. The problem is they have a takeoff. You have somebody that you know will buy your electricity, and then you can get funding. You can do everything. But I can't get clients to take off to buy my electricity for a reasonable price and guarantee they will buy it for the next 5 years, for example.
Can I add to that? The problem we've got, that is exactly what the 19 energy policy was, and it crashed and burned. Because the short answer is, if you've got a power station and you want to buy the power, first of all, the Eskom cost was too low, and is still too low at the moment. Eskom's still making power way below the cost of the IPPs. The problem is that you're not only going to have power when he's running, you're going to have somebody who says, when he's not running, I must provide power. And the capacity cost, the charge you should charge for the capacity, if you're of the R1.70, they're paying about 30 cents is energy. R1.40 is making sure that you can turn that on and it works. If you only want to make your food at midday when the sun's shining, that's fine. But you must understand that you're not going to have food at night.
I think it's a very good point, Dave. Let's not get into the detail of Eskom and the rules tonight.
Eric Piers, I'm interested, you said that you would increase private income tax. Personal income tax.
Yeah. Okay, let me give you a reason. The question is, why will I increase personal income tax? I wouldn't want to do that. But I'm trying to be sort of pragmatic in my... I also want to get some votes. And that's certainly not the best solution. There are better solutions. Increase VAT probably a little bit more. I'm just saying, I just want to be honest here. If I implement my tax mix here, you can't do it overnight. And you may require, or you may need to increase certain taxes. And one tax that you can sell politically much easier will be to increase the personal income tax. But that's certainly not my final. There's nothing like a good tax system. And there's nothing like a good tax. All taxes are always bad. But there are less bad taxes. And the least bad tax is theoretically a poll tax, which simply means we all pay exactly the same. We all pay 1,000 Rand a month, as an example. Now, I know Kusatu is going to jump up and down because they're going to say some people are rich, some people are poor. But you don't use it. The theory says, and there are very good reasons for that, don't use the tax system to achieve certain political or social objectives. Use your spending side of the budget. So let everybody pay exactly the same, but only spend your money on certain people, on the poor, as an example. So that's sort of what it's supposed to be in the end. But in the interim, I guess there must be some tax increases, and that could be it. But that's not my perfect solution, no.
Sebastian Chassel, I'm a private individual. I'd like to find out your opinion on whether it is possible to elicit certain trends from government policies. For example, the state took private mineral rights. The state wants to take private immovable property. The state wants to take private healthcare. The state has abolished certain bilateral investment treaties, thereby weakening property rights. Can that be seen in essence as part of a bigger Marxist-Leninist trend? Is it do we have yet another African story of a former liberator turning tyrant?
Yeah.
Do we have any sort of any glimmer of hope? Do we need the liberation from the liberators?
Yeah.
You know, how does one challenge that on an intellectual level if you
Yeah.
don't agree?
Interesting, if you look at what's been happening with the ANC before 1994 and after 1994, before 1994 it was a typically left-leaning liberalist or libertarian kind of organization. And you saw many of those in Africa, Southeast Asia and South America, and whenever they come into power they do disastrous things to the economy. That's always the case. That was not the case with the ANC. When they came into power, they did really, really good things. Imagining where they come from and imagining what they could actually do, you have to really be surprised at what they actually did. For example, Tito Mboweni is an excellent example. Tito Mboweni was appointed as governor of the Reserve Bank, I think 2 years before he actually took over the Reserve Bank, and he'd worked under Crystals for that period to learn. And they had other private sector ministers of finance as an example. So there was a transition period, and the political leadership of the ANC realized this. And if you want to give a name to the ANC just after 1994, I would call it a new liberalist kind of political party. And somewhere things started going wrong. And I think started going wrong with the weapons scandal. I think that's when it started going wrong, and people realized suddenly, but yeah, there's a nice big pot of honey here, and if I can get my straw into this honey pot, I can really live quite nicely for a long. And that's when things started, and then from then it just simply went south. And I think what we have at the moment is an ANC that realize that they've messed everything up, and they're starting to panic, and they're starting to grab at straws, and the only straws that's part of their DNA is the old liberation stuff. And if you want to know what the old liberation stuff is and where they come from ideologically, it's important to understand that they are not Marxist-Leninists, as you've said. They are Leninists, because the Communist Party is the intelligentsia and a tripartite alliance, and they are a bunch of Leninists. They are not Marxist. And the biggest difference is that they believe in a centralization of power. And that's gruff. So where's it going to end? Not in a nice place. Usually where these sort of things end, economically speaking, it ends with very high levels of inflation. That's where it ends usually. You have a central bank that's under good control at the moment, so they will keep on increasing interest rates. I'll keep monetary policy tight and tight and tight until they simply will buckle under the political pressure. It will happen eventually. So, but that's something that we must try to keep intact as long as we possibly can. So it ends in inflation, or in a worst case scenario, it ends in something worse. It ends in a disintegration politically of South Africa, or it ends in, I don't want to mention, violent situation or whatever in South Africa. But I'm not very optimistic about where we're going to end at the moment.
No, behind you, and then you.
Was it? Yeah.
William Horn from Media 24, business journalist. So my economics professor also mentioned ad nauseum the relationship between inflation and unemployment, and how low inflation with high unemployment figures, and vice versa. So I'm curious, in your manifesto, you target a point measure of 2%, given our very high unemployment levels in this country.
No, that's nonsense, of course.
Could you elaborate on that?
Okay, let me elaborate. Okay, why is a point and not a band? The reason why I target a point and not a band is because once you have a band, the top one becomes the point. The second reason is why I target 2% is because most of our major trading partners got a 2% target, or implicitly or explicitly. In fact, I would rather target, if anything, a 0% inflation. You say that there's a relationship between unemployment and inflation. There could be, but at most it's a short-term relationship. And if you really want to reduce unemployment, the best that you could do from a monetary point of view is to have sound money. And that means low inflation. And eventually unemployment will catch up with that. The reason why you have unemployment in South Africa is because of other reasons, not because of monetary policy. It's because of labor legislation is a good one. But the primary reason is simply because the economy is just not growing. It's not because of monetary policy.
Dawie, you said just now.
Sorry, did you say who you are?
Ian Cruikshanks.
Ian Cruikshanks.
I don't know.
Where's it going to end?
Yeah.
Was your question. When Tito Mboweni was first appointed, he came in and he said, do we really need SAA? And the next question would be, do we really need any of the other state-owned enterprises? The answer in the meantime from the ANC seems to be we're going to hold on to them.
Yes.
So that's probably then going to happen. We're going to have to exercise a whole lot of the state guarantees. That's going to put, like opening a plug and expecting the water not to run out, it's going to be a disaster. It'll take the country's rating with it. So it's only a matter of time before that happens.
Yes.
How long do you think that'll be?
How long is it going to, before we... Remember, when the economy goes down, it's not like a car crash. You don't drive into a brick wall and it's all over. It doesn't happen like that. It's a gradual process. And in that gradual process, sometimes the good things happen and sometimes bad things happen. So it's a sort of a bumpy road. And eventually you end up when things are really going... There are rich people in Zimbabwe even today. So it's... There are two of them, yeah. So I think we have to realize that it's not sort of the end of the road, and we can still turn this around, and we should try to turn it around, and that's what you and I should be doing as economists, try to spread the good news, or to spread the good ideology as much as nobody listens. That's the point. But I'm afraid we haven't seen a turnaround yet. Eskom is an excellent example. Ramaphosa is saying we're not going to fire anybody. We're going to break it into 3 pieces. We're going to give them 23 billion rand in a year, and everything is going to be fine. That simply does not add up. So no, but it's not a brick wall tomorrow morning.
But then isn't it just a matter of a relatively short term before we get a cataclysm of these sort of events, and we'll be downgraded, and the economy will go into the lower basement?
We're probably going to do sort of stepwise lower and lower. We are already lower at the 1%. Now it's going to go to nothing and a recession sort of.
Okay.
Hi, Dawie. Peter Major, private. Don't we have our tax system kind of ass about face? Shouldn't death taxes, inheritance taxes be 70–80%? Because they really only apply to rich people that have accumulated a lot of money anyways. And shouldn't we have lower taxes? When people are busting their ass, just out of school, just making money, raising a family, they should be paying low taxes because they need the money to do things with.
Yeah.
Not when they're old.
That's a very interesting. Let me just summarize what you've just said and correct me if I'm wrong. But essentially, what you're saying, if you're old, you have a lot of money, you're not going to spend it anyway, and your kid's going to inherit it, and they haven't worked for it. So zap those guys, tax that capital. Tax, nail them.
10 million and
well,
100 billion goes somewhere else.
The young people that start off with very little and they still have a long way to go to build up something, don't tax them that heavily. So that's basically, I think, your argument. And it sounds a little bit like a certain Monsieur Piketty, if I'm not mistaken. I think my answer to that is it's part of the reason why people work. And the biggest, well, the dearest thing, certainly to me and I believe to all of you, is your kids. And the reason why you work is because you want to create a nice starting place for your kids. And you want your kids to inherit whatever you've worked for. And I would even go as far as say that is what we call a civilization. Because a civilization is something that's built over many, many generations. And that's part of it. Moving your capital, not necessarily in the form of cash, but it can be in many other forms, in the form of giving them good qualifications or giving them the respect of certain things, like, for example, private. That is part of a civilization, this continuum from grandparents to parents to kids and their kids and so on.
Buffett and Gates are oddballs. Because they don't believe in that, they're oddballs.
No, Bill Gates.
Well, him and Buffett, they're not giving their kids, they're giving them 10 million each. Yeah. That's
But you're completely missing out on that. It's not only about money. They've also given the best schools there is, certain values and all that. That's all part of the whole thing. If you're going to tell me that in my case, and I'm very rich compared to the rest of South Africa, and I'm not rich, but if you tell me you're going to take away my wealth the day I die, and I will not be allowed to give it to my kids, I promise you I will hide it, and you will not get a cent.
You have a reason $10 million. That's a good limit.
And that's a philosophical argument.
John McIver, Peter Major is talking rubbish. I'm saying very simply this. People who've worked all their lives, they've made their sacrifices. They've survived a National Party government in this country. Personal income tax at one stage, for those who are old enough, was around 72%. Just before you forget anything. Yes, Dawie? Yeah. So it's not all bad here. I'm not trying to make a case for the ANC or anything like that. But make no mistake, my generation, there have been sacrifices in this country. And I think a civilized country, I would submit, should in actual fact reduce taxes on anyone who's made their contribution beyond a certain age.
Can I add to that? There's very good there's apart from the ideology or whatever you want to call this, but there's very good economic arguments why it's not a good idea to tax capital. It's a very bad idea to tax capital. Don't tax capital. And that's part of my manifesto. I will get rid of all capital taxes. It's better to tax the fruit of the tree than to cut off the branch, because that is what capital is. Yeah.
Costa Martini, a private individual. What's actually happening to the tax base, the personal income tax base? Is it growing? Is it shrinking?
Yeah.
And also, just on the company side, I didn't expect to see that trajectory so far down. Is that what's affecting that?
There are two things on the personal income tax. Well, on the tax base, generally speaking, the tax base with the current mix of taxes that we have in South Africa is getting narrower. It's because the taxes are going up for personal income taxes. So that means fewer people are paying more of the taxes. But there's another variable that's probably more important, and that's called the tax buoyancy. And tax buoyancy simply means that if your economy grows by 1%, and if you have a neutral tax buoyancy, then tax collections will also go up by 1%. Typically, what's been happening in South Africa in recent years, if the economy grows by 1%, tax collections increase by 1.1 or 1.2% actually. That was a positive buoyancy. What we've seen in recent years is buoyancy actually coming down to 1 or actually below 1. The point I'm trying to make, it's not only the tax base that's getting narrower. They try to widen the tax base by increasing VAT, for example. But what's in fact is happening, especially in the past budget, the tax base is getting narrower. But more importantly, people are actively and aggressively trying to evade taxes. And you can see that in the buoyancy of taxes. And that's more important. Yeah.
Any more questions? Perhaps we'll take a final question and then we'll close it. I'm sure you've...
The second part of my question on the company.
The companies. No, the companies, there are a number of reasons for company taxes coming down. The most important reason has to do with economic activities, and another reason has to do with that company taxes are actually coming down, internationally and in South Africa. Although we're not following the international trend to the same extent, but we better start cutting our company taxes or we're not going to get foreign investments. We have to realize this.
The portion that it contributes was coming
down. Also keep in mind that the whole tax stake has been increasing. So even if you keep the company taxes constant, it will fall relative to the rest, because the rest has been getting bigger. So that's part of the reason.
Last question.
Tony Hampson, Tyndale, private. Several times you've said we have a problem with unemployment. I don't think you're correct.
No, I agree with you. I'm not correct.
We have a problem with population growth, which is extravagantly in excess of the growth in the economy. And secondly, the population that we have that's unemployed, I can assure you will stay unemployed for the rest of their lives because they're unemployable and they don't have the skills which businesses are prepared to pay for. And just as an illustration, some years ago, a friend of mine saw a program on television about a brewery in the United States, and there's a chopper flying over this huge facility of silos and pipelines and valves and whatever else you have in breweries. And they said, now we're going to show you the labour force, and they go inside a control centre, and there's 20, 30 PhDs behind screens. That's the entire labour force. We have no home for the people who are unemployed, but the real source of the problem is not unemployment. The source is a population growth which is extravagantly in excess of what we can actually handle.
Yeah, I hear what you say. I agree. I did mention unemployment as a problem. I don't see that as a problem. That is not where the problem is. The problem is also not with population growth. I've got a slightly different take on that. The real problem is with primary education, because if we want to address economic growth and therefore also unemployment and therefore also population growth eventually, you have to start where it matters, and that is with education. Proper primary education. It's good to have university students and PhDs, that's good, but you have to start where it matters, and that is especially the important, I've done presentations on that, on the importance of girls, especially girls. the impact on the society if you have girls that are with proper primary education. That's where you need to start. And then these other things will fall in place. So don't pick the wrong problems. The problem is not unemployment. The problem is economic growth. The problem is not population growth, which, by the way, has been coming down. The problem is actually a lack of property, primary education and so on. But I guess we're saying the same thing. But we have to fix the problem in the end. Always starts where it matters, and that is with proper world-class primary education, especially for girls. Boys as well, but especially girls.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for your questions. I'd now like to ask the Free Market Foundation's Executive Director, Leon Lowe, to thank Dawie properly and to close proceedings.
Thanking Dawie is difficult and easy. Easy because he's so entertaining and informative, and difficult because he covers so much. So I'm actually not going to do what is the tradition in South Africa of the person doing the thanking, highlighting some of the points that were made. There were too many, and whichever ones I highlight, you would probably think I haven't picked on the right ones. I'm not quite going to neglect that tradition in South Africa. I will at least say something. One is that the budget, Tito Mbowene's budget, was essentially boring. It had nothing in it. Nothing changed. It was quite fascinating. And the press, for those of you who are from the press, of course, always says the same thing. The minister had a difficult job, had to balance things, tough conditions, a challenge, etc., etc. Well, the way he dealt with it was just to do nothing, essentially. Then a few other things. One was the suggestion that you skipped over, so I want to just touch on that the place to watch for the future is India. I did something very peculiar. I've written an Indian novel, a Bollywood novel, one of the odd things I've done. And I agree. I think India is the place to watch for the future for all sorts of reasons, which Dawie obviously knows about but didn't go into. So, like him, I encourage you to find out more about what's going on there economically and otherwise. There were insightful stuff about the productivity of our civil servants, or lack of it, and then the fascinating thing about the splitting up of South African Airways into three. Apparently the front, the fuselage, and the tails would be sort of but I would also just remind you that just 2 years ago or so, or a year ago, the idea was to consolidate three into one. It was South African Airways, South African Express, and Mango. So it seems as if what you do is you either just divide it, and if you divide a debt, you end up, it's true, each debt is smaller, so it looks a lot better. Or you just consolidate them, and same with Eskom, split it up. But why? You know, what will be the purpose of it? And Dawie did suggest a reason why you might want to. And then he referred to the parasitals and getting their debt into government hands, and I've never understood why this isn't done. People endlessly talk about whether the government issues a guarantee for SAA or Eskom or NERSA or NEXA or Denel or whatever it might be. And I've never had anyone explain to me why it matters. The government clearly is going to pay the debts of a state-owned enterprise. They guaranteed what in America during the subprime crisis was called implicit guarantees. You don't need an explicit guarantee. And if we were members of the board of a bank and any parasital wants to borrow money, we would assume that the real debtor would ultimately be the Treasury. That's it. The relevance is the extent to which the Treasury is solvent, not the parasital. And I'm going to close, not to comment further or thank Dawie anymore. Thanking him is, as I say, easy yet difficult. He's entertaining and informative. What I'm going to close with instead is to tell you about a new book, today's book from the Free Market Foundation, an excellent book by Martin van Staden, which is for sale in the front there. And I think that I could show you where I started reading it
and flagged, and I was stuck there until page 40. So I read up to page 40, which means it's highly readable. Yes. It's accessible, it's readable, it's about the rule of law and the Constitution in South Africa. And Martin goes into what the Constitution law is, that's him over there, what the rule of law is. He's an outstanding colleague of ours, and describes the rule of law in terms that lay people can understand. And it's very interesting. If you say to somebody you're for the rule of law, everyone says, yes, I'm for the rule of law. But if you say to people, what is the rule of law, including professors of law, you get, if any answer at all, a garbled and confused answer. And it's quite tragic and sad, actually, how everyone thinks they know what the rule of law is. They think they're for it, but virtually nobody, including professors of law, can give you a coherent conception or definition of it, which Martin does in lay and accessible terms in this book, and goes further and explains why the rule of law is a precondition for a country to be prosperous. There will be an official launch on the 27th of March, and I'd encourage you to come and hear Martin speak on the subject and do what no one else in South Africa, other than those who attend that, will have done, and that's to actually find out what the rule of law means. And it is not law and order, for example. That is one of the very popular misconceptions. So, Martin, congratulations, excellent book. Dawie, again, thank him in the appropriate manner for another tour de force, another entertaining and informative edutainment talk. Thank you, Dawie.